Hi. Welcome to Australian Literature 102. My name is James Ley. I'm the editor of the Sydney Review of Books. And I'm pleased to have with me here this afternoon Sophie Cunningham. Now, Sophie began her career as a publisher with the quite legendary publishing house McPhee Gribble. She's also worked with Penguin and Allen and Unwin. She did her time as the editor of Meanjin, one of
I like that phrase.
one of Australia's venerable literary journals. But of course, most importantly, she's a writer herself, fiction and non-fiction. Her novels Geography and Bird. And more recently, she published Melbourne, which is part of New South's Cities series of non-fiction books. And Sophie's here to talk to us about Joan Lindsay's Picnic at Hanging Rock from 1967. So I'll hand it over to Sophie, and we can have a chat about it after you've given your lecture. Thanks.
I'm pleased that there are quite a few people here because the film's not obscure, but the book is obscure, and I'm really pleased that a lot of you are interested in it. I've always been fascinated with it for quite personal reasons, and I think actually that's one of the things that defines this book is people actually do feel quite personally about it. My mother went to Clyde at Mount Macedon and used to tell me stories about what really happened to the girls. And indeed, in a strange twist, my partner also went to the same school when it was called Braemar College. Hanging Rock, the rock itself is an extraordinary piece of our landscape, and to have an entire novel kind of dedicated to it, I think is one of the really evocative things about both the book and the film, of course. And I'm not sure how many of you here have seen the film and not the book, but they're quite different. Just to give you a little bit of background on Joan, she was born in St Kilda I haven't actually got her birth date down. It would have been around 1900. So she was born around the time, actually, that the girls disappeared, which is an interesting piece of timing. She studied painting at the National Gallery of Victoria in the late 19teens. She married Joan Lindsay in London on St Valentine's Day 1922. She was very bad with time. Watches always stopped for her. This comes up with Hanging Rock. And the only day she could ever really remembered was St Valentine's Day. And again, that's obviously significant in terms of the novel. During the Depression, the couple were having a bad time financially, and they moved to Bacchus Marsh, which is not so far from Hanging Rock, and grows out of those same volcanic plains. Poor Darrell Lindsay, I think partly because of the Depression, abandoned his attempts to become a painter. I don't know if he was a good one or not, to be honest, and he became director of the National Gallery of Victoria, and he held that position from 1942 to 1955. She has written several plays which haven't been published. She's written articles, reviews, stories. She co-authored the history of the Australian Red Cross with several other people. She was one of the founders of the National Trust. Her only other book was a book called Time Without Clocks, which describes her early married life and a period of time where time was of no relevance, and she found that very kind of freeing, kind of from the constraints of the day. Because the day was not relevant. In fact, the novel itself, I think, is sort of out of time in a strange way. It's partly because it's a historical novel. You forget that it was written in 1967. It feels like it was partly because the style is old-fashioned in some ways, and obviously the events were set so long ago. It was actually a novel of the 60s, and there are some signs of that, I think. She died as recently, actually, as 1984. Now, everyone has their own version. Just for those, I'm assuming you all know the story, but for those of you who don't, two girls went missing on Hanging Rock on one hot Valentine's Day in 1900. Girls from a school Appleyard College. Many people believe it was based on the school Clyde. It was, in fact, based on the school Clyde, but back in 1900, the school was actually in St Kilda. So that long coach trip that opens very early in the novel was based on a buggy trip all the way from Melbourne, not from Mount Macedon. And it's actually a strange coincidence, given the stories around the college, that the college ended up moving to overlooking the Rock. The Rock is at the centre of the book. It's the centre of everything that happens. And at one point, Lindsay writes, "The shadow of the rock lay with an almost physical weight upon their hearts." And I think for you, I'm assuming you've all visited it, but if you haven't, it does. It's very kind of powerful. Rock. Anyway. Everyone has their own version of what happened. My mother and her school friends believed that the girls actually sort of skittered down the other side of the Rock, went into Woodend and hung out with some boys down in Woodend. So it reminds me a little bit of those rumours that when I went to John Gardner High School and we were always talking about what the girls at MLC did. It was probably a version a bit like that. But she was always very clear to say that it was not... she wasn't always very clear to say that it wasn't based on a real event. She started to say it wasn't based on real events after the film led to an extraordinary resurgence of interest in the book, and everyone wanted to know what really happened. And so that was the point at which she said, it didn't really happen. Because, in fact, she says fairly teasingly at the opening of the book, sort of like a little epilogue, "Whether Picnic at Hanging Rock is fact or fiction, my readers must decide for themselves. As the fateful picnic took place in the year 1900 and all the characters who appear in this book are long since dead, it hardly seems important." And this sort of phrase, "it hardly seems important," is quite, a provocative one. She's being quite playful because clearly it is interesting to people. Her agent, John Taylor, has written, was sitting with her one day, and he describes a scene in which she handed some more letters from people who'd been researching fruitlessly through old newspapers, hoping to find the real events. "I remarked that it was sad they wasted so much time." "Yes," said Joan, but then absently also said, "But something did happen." But I think it's a problem that we as readers are obsessed with trying to figure out what really happened when we read novels, not just this one, any novels. It's as if the fictional creative element is an annoying extra layer that to be sort of ignored as far as one can. Richard Ford has talked about this back in the year 2000 at Adelaide Writers' Week. He said, "The realm of the imagination eludes readers more and more. In fact, it irritates them. They want facts, and when they do read fiction, they try and pin down the real facts that underlie the novel." He then went on to tell, very amusingly by all accounts, a story about the number of people a man who punched him out for being unfaithful to his wife when a character had been unfaithful to his wife. Of course, gossip also suggested that he was slightly protesting too much. But at the Sydney Writers' Festival, not long after that, Brian Castro talked on these issues as well, and he commented that definitions of fiction and non-fiction ignore why writers write. The imagination is rebellious. A piece of writing should not be approached by how it's categorised. Ian Sison, who was a former editor of Overland and is an independent publisher, has said, "Maybe there's also something in the Australian makeup that works against fiction. We don't reward dreamers and visionaries, but practical people. At its best, this is manifest in the position that people like Fred Hollows and Weary Dunlop hold in the national psyche. But at its worst, it ends up being the moral and intellectual vacuum inculcated by people like John Howard and Alan Jones." To Sison's point, there's no doubt that Lindsay was a dreamer, and I think her phrase, "it hardly seems important," was sincerely meant by her. But the tricky question of fiction versus non-fiction is just a starting point for the problems of category created by a novel like Picnic. It could be characterised as a gothic novel, verging as it does on the kind of horror that readers might identify with Edgar Allan Poe and other 19th century writers. Lindsay herself had no trouble, for example, with the idea that ghosts existed. She believed in ghosts. She talked about seeing the figures of many nuns roaming a particular area, and she knew that those nuns had died long ago. This is going to be full of spoilers, so if you don't want any, you'll have to leave. I'm afraid. So similarly,
can you have spoilers in a novel where no one knows what actually happened?
Well, you could. There are spoilers. With this, there's actually the 18th chapter, which I'll be talking about, where a lot of people don't actually know what happens. Anyway, it's full of. There's the corpse of Sarah Wyburn towards the end of the novel, who stares at Mrs. Appleyard from one fixed eye, from her mask of rotting flesh. Heads are impaled upon crags, people burned to death, their bodies in the garden. Edith, froggy, piggy Edith, runs down the side of the rock having seen untold horrors. So there are real elements of horror in this book. And at times it flirts with erotica and romance. It's an intensely homoerotic novel. It's frank admiration of schoolgirls' bodies and the atmosphere that might grow when so many young women and their teachers are trying to live together. Certainly, quite actually confronting when you think about the kind of debates we have around those issues today. She's quite shameless, really. When she introduces the character of Irma, who's the girl who's survives whatever it is that happens, the girl that gets found. She says, the girl's voluptuous little breasts, her dimples, full red lips, naughty black eyes and glossy black ringlets were a continual source of aesthetic pleasure. And the French mistress herself is this kind of intensely kind of erotic. There's always sort of Helen Morse plays her very beautifully, actually, in the film. And she and Miranda being the central figure who disappears, both of those women have a lot of erotic power. Sarah, she who dies in the garden, adored Miranda, just was in love with her, and Miranda has to say, you can't just love me. It's relatively explicit. There's a scene when they're at the rock, as Miranda gets up to leave, and the French mistress is watching her walk towards her final ascent of the rock. She says, it simply wasn't possible to explain to Miss McGraw, of all people, her exciting discovery that Miranda was a Botticelli angel from the Uffizi. Impossible to explain or even think clearly on a summer afternoon of things that really mattered. Love, for instance, when only a few minutes ago the thought of Louis's hand expertly turning the key of her little clock had made her feel almost ready to faint. When there's a lot of talk of the clothes that women wear and the way it kind of they compress them, the way they sort of stop them connecting to the world. It's not so much a feminist point, I don't think, as it's a feminist point only in that women had to wear more of these kind of clothes, but she's really, I think, throughout the novel mounting an argument for white people's lack of connection with the land and with landscape, and women's clothing gives her a particular way of working with this. So when the girls arrive at the rock, begin their picnic, she writes, insulated from natural contacts with earth, air and sunlight by corsets pressing on the solar plexus, by voluminous petticoats, cotton stockings and kid boots, the drowsy, well-fed girls lounging in the shade were no more a part of their environment than figures in a photograph album, arbitrarily posed against a backcloth of cork rocks and cardboard trees. There are quite a lot of these kind of images of sort of two-dimensional people and landscapes, which is the kind of almost English landscapes, and people that are kind of performing themselves. In at its extreme, Mrs. Appleyard, who is the headmistress, her outfits are described in a huge amount of detail, and particularly her helmet of hair. And as she walks towards her death, she flings herself off the rock at the end of the original version of the version of the novel that was published. And as she perspires under the stiff lace at her throat, her heart pounds under her heavy coats, her kid boots are too thin for the rocks upon which she walks. This obsession with corsets becomes a part of the plot. Miss McGraw, who's the maths teacher, the three girls go off walking to the rock, and then the maths teacher doesn't follow them exactly. She just decides that she wants to also go for a walk on the rock. And we find out at a certain point, because Edith, who has sort of escaped, run away from whatever it is that happened, talks about the fact that she saw Miss McGraw walk past her, but Miss McGraw had no bloomers, was only in her bloomers and wasn't properly dressed. And when Irma is found on the rock, her corset has been removed and she's otherwise untouched. And that leads to a lot of gossip that she perhaps has been interfered with. In fact, the police refuse to follow up on that clue because they don't want to taint her good name, and they'd rather not know about why her corset may not have been removed. Now, in the missing chapter 18, which I'm going to talk about at some length towards the end of my talk, the girls take off their corsets on the ledge. And then when they fall asleep, when they wake up, they can't see their corsets anymore. They take them off and they fling them off the rock, like, yeehaw, I don't have to wear these things anymore. And then this is what happened. They all turned their heads to the right, and there, sure enough, were the corsets becalmed on the windless air like a fleet of little ships. Miranda had picked up a dead branch long enough to reach them and was lashing out at the stupid things seemingly glued to the background of grey air. "Let me try," Marianne said. Whack, whack. "They must be stuck fast in something I can't see." "If you want my opinion," croaked the stranger, who's Miss McGraw, "they stuck fast in time." So you have this image of the corsets just sort of stuck in the air. That was not in the published version of the book. Hanging Rock pretends to be a thriller of sorts. It even flirts with procedural crime, but when it comes down to it, shows actually absolutely no interest in solving the crime. The film is actually better at describing what the police do, the search that goes on the rock. The film is more plot-driven and takes a lot of the ideas that Joan Lindsay has playing with and scenes she describes, but sort of does so in a focused way. It's a bit of a science fiction novel as well, but seems to have no idea or care for that genre any more than it has any interest in sticking to the conventions of a crime novel. She's playing with time, as I've mentioned, or they get to the rock, or the watches stop at 12. After Irma is found on the rock, it's as if she's been there for a few hours, not actually, it's almost a week before she's found, but it's as if she's only been out there for a few hours. Mike, the young Englishman who finds her, seems to have slipped through time. There's a long sequence where they talk about Miss McGraw, the maths teacher who disappears, describes the rock as being millions and millions of years old, older than we can ever imagine. And the girls repeat that talk of what it's like to be in the presence of such age. At one point, the characters are all described as the English characters who have been searching for the girls. Are described, I'll read this. Albert had no sooner disappeared through a gap in the laurel hedge when, with the precise timing of 3 wooden figures on a Swiss clock, Mike came out of the house and Irma, there is always a little wooden lady, appeared at the boathouse door. She stood there watching him hurry towards her, limping a little over the dappled grass. So the idea of there kind of almost being, it harks back to what I was saying about the performative nature of a lot of the English characters, the way they're acting out and the little kind of figures coming out of the Swiss clock, but also that there's this constant references to time. The idea of I skipped something, making the point out thrillers. Those of you who watch thrillers these days would be familiar, I think, with the idea, which Joan Lindsay certainly explores, of making it, of the crime not being the important thing. What's important is the effect it has on everyone around it, and certainly Lindsay does that. And if you ever watched The Killing, you would have seen that show had the same focus. But Lindsay has even less care than a show like The Killing had kind of letting you know what happened at all. For those of you who watch Breaking Bad, I think it's the fourth season, there's a sense that one death ends up having this kind of very traumatic effect and results in a plane crash which rains debris over the landscape in a series of very unrelated events. That's much more like what Joan Lindsay is trying to do, that playing with ideas of chaos theory or the butterfly effect. Because as for plot, well, to be frank, the book it doesn't stand up to any kind of plot analysis. And as I've said, the film pulls the plot into some kind of order. But the novel itself is more of a whirlpool or an attempt to describe, as I said, chaos theory. All her interest is in the ramifications of the girls' disappearance, even if these ramifications lack coherence or logic. So Irma loves Mike forevermore, and that's going to change her life permanently. Mike's the young Englishman who finds her on the rock. Dora Lumley, one of the teachers from the school, and her brother die in a fire. Sarah is killed or kills herself, it's never clear. The school closes, Mrs. Appleyard suicides. Albert, one of the workers that finds her, becomes very wealthy. And these are almost unrelated events, but they've all been set in train by what happens on the rock. And one of the things that Lindsay does really well is just with a single sentence kind of suggesting how people's lives will unfold. So Irma, the reason we know that what is going to happen to Irma is there's just this paragraph which says, it was like this that Irma would later remember Michael Fitzhubert most clearly. Quite suddenly he would come to her in the Bois de Boulogne under the trees in Hyde Park, a lock of fair hair hanging over one eye, his face half turned to follow the flight of a swan. And so you know immediately that she's going to that she will end up living the life of an heiress, that she and Michael will never get together, which is sort of being played with. And she does this a lot, just throws out lines where you suddenly realise whatever narrative resolution you're expecting, it's not going to happen. And she tells you what does happen. But I want to finish by talking about chapter 18, which was a chapter in... She wrote the novel in about 4 weeks, and which is very quick, obviously. And I think it was John Hooker. I couldn't actually find which who was a editor and publisher at Penguin Books wasn't prepared, suggested that she cut the chapter. And once I read the chapter as an editor, I would have made the same suggestion. It's kind of nuts. I'm going to read it to you. Really nuts. And it actually does attempt to tell you exactly what happened and give you closure in a way that I think goes against this kind of spirit of much of the novel. But I do think it's important because it conveys very much what Lindsay actually intended. The fact that chapter 18 was cut means that there are some very strange moments in the book that most of you would have read. That is, little sections of chapter 18 have been shoved into chapter 3, basically. So you end up, those of you who know the book in detail, the girls walk up to a ledge, fall asleep, and then walk up to another ledge and fall asleep, for reasons that aren't really... It's really the same ledge. It's almost like the passage that has been repeated. But what has happened, I'm going to ruin it for you, is that the girls have come across a hole in time. The chapter opens. It is happening now as it had been happening ever since Edith Horton ran stumbling and screaming towards the plain, as it will go on happening until the end of time. The scene is never varied by so much as the falling of a leaf or the flight of a bird. To the 4 people on the rock, it is always acted out in the tepid twilight of a present without a past. Their joys and agonies are forever ever new. But so by the time we're up on the ledge, first ledge, second ledge, Miss McGraw no longer has a name. They call her the clown woman. She talks about leaving her label, she uses the word label, over on another rock and gestures towards it. Soon all the women forget their names as they shift away from the idea of reality as we know it. And then I'm going to read you... It's a very interesting passage, and it's very strange. And it speaks to what she was hoping to do with the novel, I think. Irma, don't you feel it? Feel what, Marion? Not a twig was stirring on the little dried-up trees. The monolith pulling like a tide. It's just about pulling me inside out, if you want to know. As Marion Quaid seldom joked, Irma was afraid to smile, especially as Miranda was calling back over her shoulder. What side do you feel it strongest, Marion? I can't make it out. We seem to be spiralling on the surface of a cone, all directions at once. Mathematics again. When Marion Quaid was particularly silly, it was usually something to do with sums. Irma said lightly, sounds to me more like a circus. Come on, girls, we don't want to stand staring at that great thing forever. It wasn't a hole in the rocks nor a hole in the ground. It was a hole in space, about the size of a fully rounded summer moon coming and going. She saw it as painters and sculptors saw a hole as a thing in itself, giving shape and significance to other shapes, as a presence, not an absence, a concrete affirmation of truth. She felt that she could go on looking at it forever in wonder and delight, from above, from below, from the other side. It was as solid as the globe, as transparent as an air bubble, an opening easily passed through and yet not concave at all. She'd passed a lifetime asking questions, and now they were answered simply by looking at the hole. It faded out, and at last she was at peace. And this is the really weird bit. Before anyone could answer, the long-boned torso that was flattening itself out on the ground beside the hole, deliberately forming itself to the needs of a creature created to creep and burrow under the earth. This is Miss McGraw. The thin arms crossed behind the head with its bright staring eyes became the pincers of a giant crab that inhabits mud-caked billabongs. Slowly the body dragged itself inch by inch through the hole. First the head vanished, then the shoulder blades humped together, the frilled pantaloons, the long black sticks of the legs wielded together like a tail ending and two black boots. I can hardly wait for the signal, Marion said, having just watched her maths teacher turn into a crab. When presently a few firm raps were heard from under the rock, she went in quite easily, head first, smoothing down her chemise without a backward glance. My turn next, Miranda said. Irma looked at Miranda kneeling beside the hole, her bare feet embedded in vine leaves, so calm, so beautiful, so unafraid. Oh, Miranda, darling, Miranda, don't go down there. I'm frightened. Let's go home. Home? I don't understand, my little love. Why are you crying? Listen, is that Marion tapping? I must go. Her eyes shone like stars. The tapping came again. Miranda pulled her long, lovely legs after her and was gone. And this is where I just wanted to briefly talk about the kind of what might have led Lindsay to come up with such a particular way of describing what happened to the women. People have argued that really the girls died and it's just a parallel universe, which is a kind of, in a way, the most obvious reading and I think a very legitimate reading. One critic, Yvonne Rousseau, actually argued that the end was about the dream time. It was Lindsay's attempt to kind of write about Indigenous notions of dream time, of humans being able to morph into animals and vice versa, of distinctions between the past and present and future only being marginally relevant. But she does, I think, push the point to suggest, she actually suggests that the women have turned into their totem animals, a lizard for Marion, a crab for Miss McGraw, and beetles for Miranda. One of the reasons I don't buy it, actually, is because Miranda is so consistently described as a swan. There's dozens of times. People think of her as swans appear. So if she was going to be have a totemic animal, it would have been a swan.
It's a white swan, too.
A white swan, that's right, which is not a native one, that's right. But hard to get swans to fit in cracks and rocks, I suppose. And I think my general sense is that Lindsay didn't totally think things through. I mean, I think writers often don't. And sometimes we as readers try and kind of impose this really strong sense of the writer's control, when in fact I don't know that there was a strong sense of control in the way it ended. It's kind of crazy. without there kind of really being clear where she was going with it. Now, Lindsay was very committed to the idea of developing a truly national literature and aesthetics, and she succeeded with that. The fact that the book became the film also became part of that. Her husband, Darryl, was extremely interested in these issues, and the first exhibition he held at the National Gallery was of Aboriginal art called Primitive Art. And he was very keen as a curator to stress that the work's genuine artistic value and assert that it had much more, it wasn't just of ethnographic interest. So I think that Lindsay's motivations are incredibly good, and her engagement is genuine. But she has done, I think, what a lot of white Australian writers do, which is sort of get a half-assed version of their idea of the dream time and try and kind of, work with it and not in a totally successful way. And Irvine Dick has written actually about not about this particular book, but the fact that a lot of writers who were interested in what were called the Jindi Warabaks, which was a kind of nationalist writing school, tended to fall into this trap. So I would say Picnic at Hanging Rock is a slightly unhinged novel. It's rebellious and it's mad, and it's all the more extraordinary for this. So back to our parallel universes. In one, I think the girls have died. In another, they may well have transformed into crabs and snakes and beetles and become one with nature. In another, I'm sure they went down for a bit of nookie with the boys in Wood End. But we have to accept that we're stuck in this universe, and that's the one where we're never really going to find out what happened. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, Sophie. I was interested to hear that theory of the dream time, because actually the dream time didn't occur to me, strangely enough. I mean, I was reading this and there was, the landscape, time, there's a lot of emphasis on dreaming in these dreamlike states, and I didn't put the three of those together.
No.
So it is quite an evocative idea, but I don't think it is explicitly there. You were sort of sceptical of that reading?
Yes, I am a bit. I'm not. I actually do think that Rousseau is right, that that's what Lindsay intended. I don't think that Lindsay totally succeeded, and that's one of the reasons why the publishers wanted that last chapter removed, because there wasn't really enough build up to that being the scenario. She hadn't.
Well, there's not a lot of Aboriginal characters. Is there maybe a mention of a tracker at one point, perhaps? But there are no real Aboriginal characters. No, they're not. I mean, one of the things I think is interesting about the use of time here is there seems to be setting up a quite strong opposition between the kind of European culture and that classic Australian literary trope of the landscape as being sort of timeless and hostile. But there's the lacuna there is the Aboriginal people who...
No, in fact, the only character that doesn't sort of suffer a terrible fate because of his disconnection from the land, which I do think it's explicitly about, as opposed to making that... It's a step too far to say that's all about, therefore means it's all about Indigenous stuff, and that's Albert, the working class character who, in fact, gets a massive reward from Irma's parents, and his life can start, and he gets financial stability, and he's he's the only character really that comes out of the whole thing looking good, surviving and in probably having his life improved, which I do think she was kind of working with fairly caricatured ideas of English people and their stiffness. And
well, certainly early on, all that the early scenes where they are getting dressed up and going to the picnic, it's almost parodic. That they're dressed up completely inappropriately, and they're allowed to wear their gloves. They have to wear gloves, but they're allowed to take them off as a kind of. That's right. They're allowed to take the. and it's preposterous. And it reminded me, actually, there's this essay by Germaine Greer where she talks about Australian children sort of going native, by which she means, that. When we're little, we get around with no clothes on, and there's a sense of space and openness, and everybody sort of runs free, and no one has shoes on, and so on. And it's directly as a result of the climate and the landscape. And so in that passage you quoted about them being sort of, they're completely out of place.
And in fact, it's only the girls who climb the rock who do attempt to kind of remove themselves from those bonds. There's also the trope in Australian literature of the lost child in the bush, which they are children actually. They're 6.
Well, they're all high school.
Irma's the oldest and she's 17, so they're between about 15 and 17, and Miss McGraw is a woman of a certain age, a spinster of a certain age.
Yeah, yes, and the time, I think, is also kind of, there seems to be, that seems to be quite closely related to that idea of the European and the landscape.
I assume
as well.
that must be why she set it in 1900 to kind of. She could be a bit more heavy-handed in a sense about writing it. Look, we've barely been here any time at all, and she can make that claim in a kind of clearer way, maybe, by setting it back then.
Yeah, and it's closely associated with the school too. I mean, there's that. I think there's after the scene where they've disappeared and they've gone into that sort of strange, timeless place where everybody's clocks have stopped and nobody knows what time it is. The beginning of the next chapter is Mrs. Appleyard in her office, and she's constantly checking the time.
Mrs. Appleyard's a great character, and Irma actually is sort of an indication of the fact that she's not going to be able to move into this spiritual plane. As she keeps asking, she has her watch, and she talks about her watch, and she keeps wanting to know what the time is. And I think that's a suggestion that she doesn't have the spirit, the breadth of spirit to encompass what's going to happen next.
Well, Mrs. Appleyard, her brain is described as a clock at one point.
Oh, is it? Right.
Yeah,
I forgot that.
But there's also the mathematician. What's her name? Greta, is it?
Greta McGraw and
Yes.
Marion is her best student, so they're both obsessed with maths.
Yeah, and I think it might be Albert who says at one point, maths is a find. It won't help you if when you're out in the bush. So there's this sense of it being these completely alien worlds, which I think is related to the idea of the dreams, the dream logic of this.
There's someone, I actually just know this from Twitter, because when I said that I was going to do this talk, someone started following me and said that they're about to have a novel release called Dream Within a Dream, which is a reworking of Picnic at Hanging Rock, because as you say, there are dreams within dreams within dreams.
Yeah, well, there's that kind of bizarre moment where they do that when they get to the rock. The first thing they do is they lie down and fall asleep. It's the middle of the day, and so there is this sense that whole. I mean, it was interesting to hear you talk about the omitted final chapter, because if ever there was a book where it was the right thing to do to omit the final chapter, it's this one, because I think that the absence of explanation is the key factor. I mean, I think that the inability. I mean, I think one of the things I thought this novel was doing was trying to unravel the idea that we're in control of our own lives. When you think that the logic and reason and order we think we can control it, we think we can live by the clock, but in fact what we're really being controlled by is our dreams and these uncontrollable things.
And in that sense it is irrelevant what happens to the girls, because it really is the fact that the bush takes them, whatever that means, is actually enough to kind of...
Yeah, and it's and there's something very extraordinary, uncanny about that frustration to resolve a narrative. I mean, it's something like Henry James's Turn of the Screw might be analogous, where something terrible has happened, but you never know what it is, and it's all the more terrible because your imagination kind of...
I do wonder what... You can imagine if Peter Weir... He probably could have ended up with having them turn into crabs and beetles and scattering into the rocks. I don't know that the film would have taken off to the same degree. Who knows? It's just such a literal kind of attempt to resolve.
Well, yes. There's sometimes there's mistakes, like Kafka insisting that there be no image of Gregor Samsa on the cover of his book. Because you're not supposed to. Some things you're just not supposed to see.
Yeah.
But that uncanny aspect, it's almost as if it's not a Dreamtime myth, she does kind of create the girls, in Miranda in particular, this mythical figure.
In fact, that's a question I have for you, in that I don't have a clear answer to it. Is more what I'm getting at is that this sort of idea of dreaming does seem to be kind of tied in with the erotics of the novel, because Miranda is just sort of so beautiful and everyone loves her and wants to touch her, and she kind of moves gracefully, and that somehow it almost doesn't quite fit in with a lot of the other the narrative. She just is. She just kind of floats through the whole thing.
Yeah, and
which dreams you get in dreams.
Yes, and she's constant, and she haunts everybody else once she's gone. You know, she has this kind of strange, sort of almost insubstantial sort of quality, but is all the more powerful for that.
And towards the end, I think the swans disappear for the season, and you know that she's not going to not even haunt anyone anymore.
Mm. Yeah. Well, the corsets too. I mean, with there's also a detail I noticed quite right near the end where Mrs. Appleyard is glimpsed briefly, where she comes out of the room and she hasn't got her corset, and this is kind of the moment at which you realise she's becoming unhinged, you know, that it's actually...
Well, that and the booze, I didn't actually mention it, she really hits the booze. She's drinking very heavily. She's actually she's a little bit like, if you've seen Blue Jasmine, she's a bit like all those vodka shots of Cate Blanchett going for the vodka bottle at the end of every scene. She's always reaching for a brandy bottle. And I was... Again, I don't have a clear view on this. I wondered if the really explicit talk of heavy drinking and the kind of sexual, the girls' very sexual natures, whether that was a 60s thing or whether, in fact, you would find those qualities in... Whether she was replicating other historical novels which had those qualities. I couldn't kind of work out if that was an old-fashioned or a new-fashioned element, because it was the 60s.
Yeah, look, I don't know. It certainly seems to have, you know, that I guess that sort of psychosexual sort of undertone.
There are a lot of films and probably books in the 70s about crazed schoolgirls, like, you know, holding Clint Eastwood hostage and kind of torturing him sexually, and they kind of in private sporting schools and stuff. The idea of the schoolgirl as this kind of almost like a creature, with the mass being a single creature, like a kind of hive.
Well, yes, it's the
Carrie.
I don't know, could you read this maybe as an allegory of a fear of adolescent sexuality?
Yeah, no, that sort of there. You don't get the sense that Lindsay fears it at all. But she's an interesting. I mean, I felt like I would like to know her. She's obviously was quite eccentric.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think that she wrote this in 4 weeks, and it's interesting too because there is an interesting sort of shift in tone, I think, in the latter stages where it starts to become a bit more self-conscious, where I guess where she starts talking more openly about the pattern. She says, now we see that the pattern of what's happening is starting to, almost like she's kind of cajoling herself.
Now my tale is drawing to a close, kind of. She has been criticised, reviews I've come across, for the kind of variety of styles within the book. It's actually one of the things I liked about it. It's both a flawed and a wonderful novel, and often some of the works I like best have these kind of rifts in, or they kind of don't quite make sense, and there's almost the pleasure, the imperfect, like, you know, like beauty is better if there's an imperfection. There's a sense of that with this novel.
I think, particularly with certain kinds of narrative, I mean, and particularly with a narrative like this, which kind of teases you with being a kind of, you know, a detective story, a mystery story that, you know, which we expect them to be resolved, and this one, of course, isn't. And there's something sort of uniquely creepy about a story that just breaks down when you watch them. And I'm not sure. I mean, Nicola Barker sometimes does it in some of her novels, where she just pushes a story until it breaks, or some of David Lynch's films, for example. Where,
yes, in fact, David Lynch is a good analogy.
Where they just ignore the rules that they set for themselves, and so there's something, you know, suddenly this character is being played by someone else, and it's all about a kind of expressionism, I think, just filling you with that sense of unease.
And that's actually something that Peter Weir worked with beautifully in the film. I mean, I think it's quite an interesting example of a filmmaker sort of taking a novelist's vision and adding to it, reducing it in some ways, but also, I mean, one of the reasons why the book is so well known is because the film introduced so many people to the story, and it was a very significant film. When I first saw it, I don't know, I was 11 or 12 or as a teenage girl. It had a huge effect on me. It really did feel like this is what an Australian film could be. This is what Australia is. It really did capture a kind of Australian Gothic that was quite powerful.
We have got some people at the sides if anyone does want to ask a question, and so just stick your hand up and they'll bring you a microphone.
Hi, I just wondered what you made of Mrs. Appleyard's utter hatred of Sarah Wayborn, poor little Sarah. I'm pretty convinced that Mrs. Appleyard killed her.
Yes.
And I just wondered your take on that.
It is. I agree that she probably killed her. Well, she certainly killed her in one sense, if not literally, like just by making her, by persecuting her more and more. I don't have a clear sense. I mean, you could mount an argument for, repressed lesbian longing, but I don't know that. I don't know. I actually don't know why she hated her so much, but it is a very striking, quite a shocking aspect of the novel. And what happens to Sarah is actually the most shocking thing. It's more shocking than the girls going missing, partly because I suppose it's all unexplainable, but there's no beauty to that mystery at all. It's basically a girl being persecuted until she dies.
That's the moment where I got to it in the book, that's when I...
Yeah, and in the film too, and the kind of shock of the gardener finding her is really... And I partly didn't talk about it because it doesn't fit into a kind of a broader thesis I was trying to make about the ideas in the novel, because it's kind of like this thread that just stands alone of bullying, and I suppose it does take to an extreme that idea of the dangerous schoolgirl, even though the dangerous female energy that's kind of...
Well, and also that sense that she talks about of the implications of it sort of rippling outwards in unexpected ways. As the kind of school falls to pieces, she bears the brunt of it. So it's one of those aspects of there being a kind of unintended consequence.
In fact, there are some ways in which the film is... I mean, the book is quite like... one of the most famous books in the world, whose names I've just forgotten, where the schoolboy's on an island. William Golding, Lord of the Flies. Yes. Sorry. And what happens to Sarah has that aspect of intense cruelty, but also when Irma, the girl who's found on the rock, comes into the gym to say, "Oh, fine girls, lovely to see you, and I'm going to England," they kind of attack her. And it's a mad scene, and it's presented as mad. No one understands what's going on. They just like, you have to tell us what's going on. Why won't you tell us what's going on? They start ripping at her clothes, and you don't ever really know what's made the girls so enraged with her.
It's almost that they can't bear the not knowing, and just on those 2 points, I was thinking of where the body is discovered in the book, and she's had her head is kind of smashed in. It just reminded me of all the heads. I think Mrs. Appleyard ends up having her head impaled.
Yes, this is the last line of
people
this
are falling down, bumping their heads. Mike falls down and bangs his head. Irma is found. She's got a bump on the head.
And Mike, something happens to Mike as well.
Mike trips and bangs his head. So it's this physical. And then, of course, there's Edith, who is blessed with having nothing in her head, so she doesn't need to have a bang on the head, but it's almost like got to physically...
That's another way in which the novel doesn't... it can be quite shocking in terms of modern sensibility. She just talks about her as being fat and ugly. She's just kind of like totally no attempt to create any sympathy for that character.
Fat and stupid too.
Yeah,
like
she takes all those kind of... and is totally shameless. I mean, that's what I mean about it being slightly unhinged. It's kind of a little bit like watching the id come out to play at times reading
the
reading
policeman asked her what happened. She said, "Oh, look, I don't really know." And he said, "Oh, well, she's fat and stupid. No point in pursuing this line of inquiry."
Yeah. No, it's really... and she's played for laughs, as indeed we're cruelly playing it for laughs now.
Any other people wanted to just shove your hand up? It's down the front here.
I was just wondering if you knew Joan Lindsay was happy with the film and...
She was happy with the film, but she wasn't happy with the attention it brought to her. because it meant that she became, well, celebrities putting it a bit too strongly, but suddenly everyone wanted to know, wanted her to write more books, wanted her to explain what had happened, and she didn't enjoy that at all. But I think she liked the actual film. She was happy with. Yeah.
Oh, just...
You say that the novel took 4 weeks to write. Do you know what her process was and how long that was? I mean, was it in her head for a lot of...
No, I know that she was in the country, staying in their country house. I think the one in Bacchus Marsh. They had two. They had a house at Mornington Peninsula and then one at Bacchus Marsh. No, all I know is that she wrote it in a very intense 4 weeks. It was summer, so I suppose all that stuff about heat probably came from the fact she was writing it during a very hot summer. It wasn't actually a hot summer in 1900. That's one way in which the novel was, in fact, rained, on Valentine's Day, 1900. But she wanted, her kind of motivation was to write a national Australian book about being Australian. They were the ideas at work, but I don't know more than that.
Anyone else? No? Okay. I just wanted to maybe read out a bit, which occurred to me, just to tie in with what we were talking about with the kind of not knowing and the kind of narrative sort of falling apart. So it's a really interesting part where she talks about facts. Well, there's two short quotes. The first one is where she talks about Mrs. Appleyard, where she says, strong-minded persons in authority can ordinarily grapple with practical problems of facts. Facts, no matter how outrageous, can be dealt with by other facts. The problems of mood and atmosphere known to the press as situations are infinitely more sinister. A situation cannot be pigeonholed for reference and the appropriate answer pulled out of a filing cabinet. An atmosphere can be generated overnight, but overnight out of nothing or everything, anywhere that human beings are congregated in unnatural conditions. Interesting use of unnaturally.
That's a great quote.
At the Court of Versailles, at Pentridge Jail, at a select college for young ladies, where the miasma of hidden fears deepened and darkened with every hour. So it's a passage like that that makes me think that, that in a certain sense she did sort of on some level know that she was writing a story about the breakdown of a story.
Yes, I certainly don't think she would be offended by what I said. She wasn't a conventional person. She wasn't trying to write a conventional novel. She didn't have a sort of a sense of herself as being literary and needing a certain style of success. I'd be curious to actually see what her paintings were like.
Yeah, no, I've never seen them. Yeah. So anyone else? No?
Okay. Well, I had hoped I could, play panpipes or something to add atmosphere to this event. Because that was Peter Weir's invention. There's nothing resembling that kind of atmospheric tool in the novel.
Yes, it's all really about atmosphere, isn't it? Really. Yeah. And although it did also make me think back to, just harking back to the beginning of our this whole series. The first book we did this year was The Drover's Wife, Henry Lawson, and it's almost like there's an expanded version of that in here. All the way through that sense of the landscape with its snake, lots of snakes, and the insects and the.
In fact, there's a passage I was going to read where she talks extensively about that. The rustle of the insects and the sense that you can sort of hear the wind. And in a way, she's trying to say that nature is full and there are things happening everywhere. And so ants and scuttling insects are really kind of part of what she was trying to talk about, that there's nothing empty in the Australian landscape, and it's some people will fear it for that, even though she never writes as if she fears it for that. Well,
there's lots of references whenever they are out there to the ants. There's I think when they're lying on the ground. People
looking like ants. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yes, looking down. But when they're lying on the ground, there will be references to the ants' nest nearby, and of course, being a picnic, of course, they're trying to steal food and drag it away, and
all the kind of breaking down, all the kind of. Yes. Convention.
We're just about out of time. If there's any more questions, we could probably take one or two more, but we are just about out of time.
Just recently there was some talks going on in Canberra about landscape and the Australian writer. You probably both know about it. But I don't think Lindsay was mentioned. Do you think she could have been mentioned in that sense, or do you think she wasn't really connected to our landscape? She was just comparing it to the English landscape more than coming connected to our own landscape, the Australian landscape?
I get the impression that she was connected to the landscape. I mean, reading it, that she writes about the landscape as fearful to some, but seems to write about it from a place where she's very engaged. I mean, where she enjoys it. And living in Bacchus Marsh and in that kind of... she really seemed to sort of enjoy... that kind of volcanic, slightly gothic environment.
Well, there was elements of the sublime in it too, in the descriptions of the rock, being the scale of it.
Capturing the sun.
Dwarfing human beings and being sort of awe-inspiring but also kind of fearful at the same time. And it's tied in with the timelessness too. I mean, I think when whichever one it was, the character is talking about it being millions of years older. Edith, of course, she can't take it. She's stop it. She can't comprehend the idea of something being millions of years old.
I think Lindsay should have been mentioned in that context to answer your question, and I suspect one of the reasons she wasn't was because she never really developed an oeuvre. There was just the one book, this one sort of wonderful, crazy book, and I don't think she even tried to write any more.
Yeah, well, we had Elizabeth Harrower earlier in the year, and she, of course, wrote a couple of books, but then just decided to stop.
But she decided to stop for reasons of sadness about the world, didn't she? Whereas you get the impression...
I'm not sure.
From articles I've read about her, I think she despair about the industry and being depressive. I think Lindsay probably just had other things to get on with.
Fair enough. So we are out of time. I mean, if there is another question, we could maybe take one more. So one more, maybe this can be our last one.
Firstly, thank you both for your insight and analysis tonight. Just one question. I'm wondering if this novel were written today, do you think it would be published as is, or do you think Lindsay may have been requested to do a couple of rewrites or some clarification here or there?
I think she would have been. I think the latter. I mean, it's interesting. I was listening as a audio book to Anna Karenina the other day, and that's got whole chapters of kind of segue that kind of I can imagine these days a publisher would be saying, "Now, come on, we don't need to know about the wheat growing. Really, it's not hugely relevant." So I do think there's a kind of lack of attention to detail in historically with editing and publishing that actually I like the results of that rather than trying to contain everything. But I do think it was the right decision to cut the final chapter, and I do think an editor or publisher today would make that request, because it doesn't really... It goes from being a kind of beautiful and mysterious to suddenly wax quite a literal, if somewhat strange ending. But yeah, they would have, absolutely. But also they would have picked up the sleeping on two different ledges in chapter 3, which drives me crazy. I wish someone had picked that up.
Well, it could be all part of the kind of uncanny atmosphere, something in a loop and you go around again.
Yeah.
On that note, we are out of time. Thank you all for coming along this evening, and thank you, Sophie Cunningham.
Thanks. See ya.